Moritz Walther, as already discussed, but you can call me Mo. I'll be hosting the panel tonight, and I've really been spending the last 3-4 months now discussing this topic with people, intensively researching this, and I really hope that I've selected some good questions to ask for today. I think we'll just give a quick presentation here, or let these guys give a quick self-presentation about what their connection to blockchain is and also to the GDPR topic, just within a few words. I think that would be the best way to begin. From there, I'll take over then and be posing some questions. And finally, we'll also have some time to take questions from you guys. But now, just to begin, before we let these guys tell about themselves a little bit, I wanted to say a few words to what the GDPR is. I'm sure most of you have heard about it. I'm sure most of you have also heard about blockchain. But just to recap real quickly, the GDPR is a data protection regulation that is going into effect in 10 days. It's happening EU-wide, so it's not just in France here. It's all of the EU that's being affected, and the regulation is an update from previous data protection regulations that were drafted in 1995, so it's been a long, long time, and it was definitely time for it, but yeah. So in the past, data protection laws have kind of been suggested by the EU and then have been implemented nationally. So that means that French laws were a little bit different from German laws or from any other country. And the GDPR really was trying to fix that as its first goal, to make this standard so that there's a single, they call it a single digital market within the EU. So every business can do business with others in the EU and know that there's that same standard of protection everywhere. The second goal that they were obviously trying to achieve is to update these laws and kind of take into account some of these new technologies and just how this whole process of collecting data has grown over the last 20 years since the last law. And they were trying to give people more protection on that front. So that's really what this law is all about. You may also have heard that this law has a lot more, shall we say, it has teeth compared to the laws of the past. There's really very high fines that are possible through it. Up to 20 million or 4% of a company's global turnover are possible maximum fines. So obviously the lawmakers are really trying to make a step forward here and show that they're getting serious about data protection. That's enough to that, and now let's just have a quick introduction maybe from you guys. Just a quick word to what you do with blockchain and what your connection to the GDPR then is.
Okay, so I'm François de Chezel, I'm CEO of Thallium. We are an IT service company specialized in blockchains. We exist since 2012. We have a history in systems integration projects for corporate large companies in France and Luxembourg, involved in complex projects with high availability, security, etc. And in 2015, we started to switch towards blockchain projects. First, it was for pure interest, and then we realized that there were things to do with it. And since September 2016, actually, we are doing customer projects full time. So now we work quite a lot with Hyperledger Fabric, Ethereum. Now Stellar, also Monax, Hyperledger Bureau, and now is coming EOS and probably others soon. So we work with projects either with private blockchains or with public blockchains and without ICOs. Okay, so big names some of you may know. Sunshine, energy peer-to-peer project we've been working on for more than 1.5 years. Legolas Exchange, it's a cryptocurrency exchange with, which is secure by design. They had an ICO where they raised 3,500 bitcoins, so we are architects and developers of the trading platform. Also BC Diploma, we'll talk about it because it handles GDPR issues seriously. Okay, another project.
My name is Aurélie Bail. I'm currently working as a data protection officer in Ameris, a healthcare company. And I'm also at the same time doing a PhD in the University of Montpellier about blockchain facing GDPR's issues. And I'm currently doing some advisorings too for some H2020 programs and also projects like BC Diploma, for example, and we talk about it later, I think. I'm sure.
Hello, I'm Vincent Raymond. I'm working for OnePoint, which is a digital transformation company. I've been working in that area for 15 years, not only on the blockchain technology, but on all digital transformation. And for OnePoint, I'm a community leader, since we work with communities. And I'm a leader for the blockchain community and the cybersecurity community. So I'm an IT guy. And I'm coming from the algorithm part, so I'm quite eager to discuss about the IT solution that can be provided for the GDPR constraints on a technology level.
Okay, so my name is Bruno Hals. I'm the Délégué Général of the French DPO Association, so Data Protection Officer. So the association was created back in 2004. And we gather around 3,500 members, so mainly big companies, but also Sénat, Assemblée Nationale, and a lot of department, region, and cities. I'm teaching the data protection officer since 10 years right now, and I'm working in the public sector, so I ensure the compliance of one of the branch of the social security system scheme for France. So I take care of several tens of French citizens on a daily basis. So as data protection officer, we have to ensure the compliance of the personal data processing of our data controller. And let's say that a few years ago, 3 or 2 years ago, we faced a technology, so blockchain. So but it was not the first time we faced something we didn't know. So we have to learn, we have to understand. So first, the first goal, the first difficulty, I think that was the first time. Most of the data protection officers are from legal, so it's quite difficult for them to understand. And then we raise all the questions. I mean, and for me, this discussion is very interesting because there is nothing new. I mean, most of the concepts in the GDPR were in the Directive 95/46 back from 1995, and most of that, the same principle were in the French Informatique et Liberté law back in 1978, so 40 years. So there's nothing new. I mean, all the questions we are going to talk about and hope to find some solutions, they are old problems. I mean, old issue, nothing new.
Great. I think that's a great segue, and I think we'll begin from there. And let's just start then by talking about, how the GDPR, to what data is it actually addressed, and how can we put that in the blockchain context then? And so I think what's important to understand there, is that the GDPR obviously has a scope. It has a material scope and a territorial scope. And I think we should just begin then, right there with the material scope. And I think the GDPR says that it affects personal data. So this isn't any data, not every bit of data is protected. It's, specifically the data that could potentially affect people like you and me if it were to negatively get out or something. So it's data that has something to do with us. And this is, an easy concept maybe to understand at first, but once we take it into this blockchain space, I think it starts to become more difficult, and so maybe we can get concrete here, and maybe I can ask you guys then, what kinds of data do you think you would see in a blockchain or on a distributed ledger that would constitute personal data as far as the GDPR goes? Anybody, feel free.
I mean, the personal data definition is very broad. I mean, if you listen from the data protection authority, like NIL in France, every data is personal data. I mean, IP address, location, and so on. So once there is a chance to link the data, the information to identified people or even identifiable people, it's a personal data. You are under the GDPR. So I imagine that there is only a few blockchain projects which are not in the scope, in fact, I guess.
Would you agree then, or?
Just what do you mean by not in the scope?
I mean, if there is not at all personal data, which is very rare, I think.
The question was the public key at the same time.
Yeah, but I mean, perhaps your question is whether are there projects that do not handle personal data? Possibly, I don't know. Maybe projects among companies handling like supply chain things. But indeed, when people are involved, necessarily at one point or another.
Maybe IT to IT,
Yeah,
machine
right.
talking to machine. But in the story somewhere, at the end, there is a chance to have a guy or a human, a natural person.
And what I think, what you said, which was really great, was this idea of identified or identifiable being the key word. And I think, in a blockchain, usually, you have a level of pseudonymity there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the data isn't personal data just because you can't identify them in the first step there. Do you agree there? Or?
That's an important issue. I mean, pseudonymous data still are personal data. So during all the lobbying between January 2012 and from April 12/16, I mean the publication of the GDPR, I mean the GAFA tried to push the idea that pseudonymous data were not personal data, but they didn't win, they lose, and still pseudonymous data. There is a chance to come back to the people, in fact, so it is personal data for sure.
On the technical side, people may think at first sight that they are not publicly facing, they don't have public information within the blockchain, because they would say, okay, this is just a wallet address, that's not me, you cannot trace me. These are the same people that would believe that you cannot be traced with your IP address, for example. But as most of you may know, with any cross-reference, anybody can be found with even a dynamic address, IP address allocation. So it's kind of the same. Maybe there are exceptions with some explicit anonymization solutions like Monero that guarantee they provide anonymization. But apart from these explicit anonymization, people have to understand that this is not an anonymous process.
Right. Yeah. Perfect. I think that sums it up.
And I think that basically, well, the legal guys won't like what I say, but pretty much I think that the interpretation of GDPR will be different from one project to the other, because it's like in every IT project. Every IT project starts with evaluating the risks that you agree to accept during the project. The NSA gets hacked means that nothing is non-hackable. So it's the same with blockchain projects and with personal data. So depending on the data that is handled on the project,
And
the risk, yes, risks have to be accepted. At the end, it will always be, if it has to go to a court of law at some point, it will be the judge that will say if the ones who did something wrong did it or didn't do things properly or not. It will be the judge at the end, because of course, basically talking about blockchain, of course. Anything that is stored in a blockchain cannot be erased, even if it's encrypted. Okay, so we all know that. So pretty much, if you're just reading GDPR by the book, the data is there, and even if it's not the actual data that relates to that person, but it's a hash, etc., you can always trace things back at some point, because you get the document somewhere else, etc., and you realize it's the same hash, etc. So indeed, anything is personal data. So basically, you need to understand what are the risks that you accept for that project and that are acceptable by the regulator.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's a good summary there. And I want to move on then to the other half of the GDPR. You have on the one side this idea of personal data, and then obviously you need somebody who's kind of responsible for compliance. And in the GDPR, that person is called a controller. And once again, this is easy to identify if you have a centralized company, you know, that takes data from users and such, and then stores it on their servers. They are clearly a controller. But as we all know in the blockchain world, we're working with this technology that decentralizes this whole process. So again, it becomes more difficult to identify who's responsible. And Arlie, I want to ask you then, who do you think could be a controller and potentially liable then for the GDPR in this blockchain context?
The main issue to face is that the GDPR has been written for central schemes and structures. And now with the blockchain we are decentralized and we don't know how to do and who to say, okay, that's him, he is liable for this. And now the solution is to focus not on the people in the blockchain, but the people turning around the blockchain in the ecosystem. For example, in many projects, that's with an exchange, for example, because everybody knows what is, I hope, an exchange. It will be the exchange who will be in charge of the compliance and, for example, with the know your customer policy. And they will be in charge of this and they will have to handle the compliance with the GDPR. That's here that we must focus and not looking at the blockchain and saying, I want someone, I want a face, I want somebody to be in charge of it. I think this is my point of view.
So you're saying that any kind of company that kind of can become that public face if they're using the blockchain there.
Yeah, that's people who are turning around the ecosystem. And for example, for me, with an exchange, it will be the exchange to be in charge of it. And they will have this responsibility.
And then do we have, for example, if I'm just using the Bitcoin blockchain or something, and maybe I have a full node, you know, that I run on my computer, do I have anything to worry about there? Might I be responsible then for GDPR compliance because I'm storing these transactions as well?
You're raising the public blockchain issue,
Yes.
because your question is easy to answer when we're talking about private blockchain and even hybrid blockchain. But with the public blockchain, the point is, as I always say, that it's technically and by design decentralized. So you have no one, you have no governance. You can see you have no governance even when we do forks and we segwit. There's no governance at all. It's a mess. So try to point at someone and says you're accountable for, I mean, anything. It's impossible. So the easy answer would be no one is accountable. So, but would GDPR accept that answer? Not sure. So who is responsible? The miner, all the mining people with the full? I don't think so. We can ask if, for example, when we talk about smart contracts on Ethereum, are the developers accountable for what the smart contract is doing? I don't think so. I think that you have the right path. I mean, the interfaces, the intermediates should be accountable for because they are between the non-centralized mess and the people. So they are the ones that are actually handling the people personal information and the one that the links between what is not traceable and what is traceable.
I'm not sure that maybe they are liable for something, but they have to accept the risk.
Yeah.
But maybe they're not liable for the blockchain heart itself. I mean, only for the processing, as you talk, between the blockchain and the people. Maybe but there's not only one processing. There is maybe several processing interconnected. But if you want to raise a silly question to data protection authority, like the CNIL, I did myself. I was raising them the question, so where are you going to go to perform a staff inspection? Where? Because they have the possibility to do inspection, okay? But where? Where are they going to go?
Where physically?
Right. Yeah, physically, where? So
Yeah.
which office?
Your
Where
node.
location? So that's,
Your node.
that's
They're gonna
nice.
break into my house and
Yeah, no, they,
no, they're allowed
Give
to,
me the key
right?
of the
But, yeah.
garage, please.
Yeah,
I want to check.
exactly.
Do we take questions?
I think, can we keep the questions to the end if that's okay? Just remember it and we'll get to it. Yeah, I promise.
Actually, if I may say something, because the example of BC Diploma, which we talk again, because for other reasons it handles some other things with GDPR, is interesting. BC Diploma is a company that had its ICO back in
6 months ago?
okay, and what they do is they do document certification, actually diplomas, but it could be whatever, document certification onto a blockchain and not aside, onto a blockchain, and it handles the right to be forgotten. Okay, and to do that, they consider that the data is stored encrypted, and the way to decrypt it is to you need a combination of several keys actually to decrypt it, including one which is called persistence key, which you can delete. I have a diploma, I can delete it, nobody can see the data anymore. And that's interesting because going back to controller, these persistence keys, in this case, it could be differently, but in this case, the persistence keys are held by BC Diploma. So they could be the controller, actually.
It's
Or
according to the
processor.
project.
Or processor.
Or processor, okay.
Or processor.
Right.
So the,
Yeah, because the university can be at the same time controller.
Okay.
It's according to the
so
service.
multi-signature is a solution.
Could be.
A potential solution, right?
Yeah.
Let's keep that good thought, but let's try and move to that towards the end of the discussion, and then let's actually get into something else that you had just brought up there. Then the right to be forgotten. You know, I think this is the issue that is most published, I would say, when it comes to this discussion around blockchain and the GDPR. So just quickly to summarize what that is, you know, the Article 17 of the GDPR states that individuals have a right to have their data erased by controllers under certain circumstances. In general, it would be, you know, if the processing, if you're using data based on the consent of an individual, so somebody has told you you're allowed to have my data, you're allowed to store it, you're allowed to do something with it, they have the right then to say, no, I don't want that anymore, and then you'd have to go and delete the data. And so that's the general rule. There are exceptions, but that's what it's generally about. And the issue then that most people foresee then is that on a blockchain, obviously, that data that you store there is meant to kind of last forever. It gets written into this chain, it becomes immutable, and that's where people kind of see the issue, right? So I guess my question then, first of all, would you agree that this is an issue? Because I have actually heard different opinions there. And then how do we overcome this issue? Feel free, anybody.
It's not the greatest issue. I mean, for me, yes, it's simple. It's forbidden to keep the information too long. Once you reach the goal, normally you should erase. But if the blockchain, your goal is very long, you are going to keep the data very long. So I don't know exactly how we are going to react to the data protection.
Can you maybe elaborate on what you mean
I
by
mean
goal? Because I've been talking about processing based on consent here, but there are other...
So the consent is only one choice as a legal basis. And I'm surprised that for example, for consortium and private blockchain, I guess consent is not at all the legal basic. It's the contract mainly. I guess so. Maybe in the public blockchain, I guess, but in the private and consortium, I imagine the best legal basis is a contract. And to link with the previous question, in a private or consortium blockchain, GDPR offers an option we didn't have before. That's the joint controller. You may write a written arrangement, and which is going to be very clear about the responsibility and the liability of each participant, each actor in a private blockchain, for example. So you just have to make public this arrangement to the data subject, but that's it. So So, and about the data retention time, it could be very long. In my job, we have a data retention time of 70 years for retirements, for example.
Mhm.
So GDPR doesn't ask you to erase the data very quickly. If you need it very long time,
So
you
that's
keep it
one of
very
those
long time.
exceptions
So
then to this
for me,
rule.
it's not the worst
Yeah.
problem, the worst issue.
Right.
I mean, it's an issue we have to deal with, but not the number one. Yeah.
Mhm.
And the solution that you mentioned, maybe it's a good one. So if exactly it's impossible for anyone in the future to decrypt the data, so the data, they are ingeritable, and that's it. Maybe that's a solution.
So we do have some of these workarounds then too, where even if you're not technically deleting the data, you know, you still have options to maybe make it non-available, and that
That's
could
exactly
count.
the question.
But the basic idea is that today we don't know how to decrypt something that's been encrypted with AES 256. Nobody knows how to do that. People talk about quantum computing. Quantum computing won't be able to do it before some time. And anyway, when it happens in, I don't know, maybe 20 years or so, there'll be other algorithms to encrypt the data. We'll find other ways to encrypt the data.
But it's
So
a question.
that's not the issue.
It's a question of confidence. And Facebook did promise us that they were erasing our data. That was not the case. So in fact, the data protection authority are going just to inspect, and if they check, and if the technical solution is okay, it will be okay. If not, so someone will have some trouble with that. That's it.
Yeah, at some point they will have to rely on what the experts say.
They are
But-
experts. They
yeah,
are
but,
experts. So
Yeah,
themselves.
but I know that. But
They are very
I mean,
strong experts. Yeah.
I mean, technically, if someone says, "Okay, I can crack an RSA enciphering," for example, okay, that means that someone can do it. But can the CNIL or the GDP expert do it as well? I don't know. So
And that depends.
yeah, it depends.
Yeah.
It depends.
Each case is different, as you did mention.
Okay, so basically the assumption is, which is correct a priori, is that we don't know how to decrypt, okay, once it's encrypted. From then, the idea is, which is debatable, but basically erasing is simply having something encrypted that you cannot decrypt.
Unreadable.
Okay.
You do have alternatives as well to actually delete the data. You all know about the layer 2 projects on blockchain. So I mean, you don't actually store anything on the blockchain, but aside of the blockchain. So if you actually put that document on a classical database, you can just delete and just have the hash.
But you lose one of the benefits of the blockchain.
Yes,
so
you're right.
so it's a trade-off. You
Yeah,
have to find
Okay.
a good
Anyway,
balance.
every project is different, and there's no one architecture for every project. And some project will be interested in having this scenario where the blockchain handles the pointers towards certain information corresponding to one person,
Exactly.
with not having all the information at one place. And the idea is to handle GDPR at each endpoint correctly. That's one way of doing things. Depending on the project, some other projects need to have the information onto the blockchain. BC Diploma was a good example. So some other example totally different is a project we do in the energy sector with peer-to-peer energy. There's no token. It's a private blockchain, and what the idea is you notarize onto a blockchain production and data and consumption data. If you have solar panels on top of a building, you record on the blockchain the production of energy, the consumption, and then the delta you share it among other people. You share it, you sell it actually. So the idea is to notarize in the blockchain the production consumption, and the delta through a smart contract you compute how you're going to share this. And here you need the data to be in the blockchain. Personal. So I'll get into that. You need it to be on the blockchain because first all these data will be proof among different people of how much they consume the energy from the solar panels, etc. and also it computes dynamically the sharing keys for this delta of energy depending on the consumption, the life of the different people. Okay, you understand what I'm talking about? So this is something live. This is something that is that needs to be auditable. That is, you need data to prove that the okay, I paid less. I used more green energy. I pay less to EDF, but I have proof that it's right. It's because I was consuming more, etc., etc. So here you need the data to be onto the blockchain, and you need the smart contract, which is also something important. You have to understand the smart contract. For those who don't know, a smart contract is a program that runs on the blockchain that you can trust because it runs on the blockchain. So basically, it has data, it has inputs, and there's an action, there's a result, there's an output. But these inputs, you must trust them. To trust the smart contract, you must trust the inputs that it uses. So if you trust the inputs, they have to be on the blockchain. Okay, so basically, either you each time you use the smart contract, you go get the info somewhere else, and you need oracles, etc. So it's complicated, or you have the data on the blockchain. So, for example, with this project, you have the data on the blockchain. Then the question is raised on the blockchain. What problem? What do I do for its protection? That's why I said earlier, it totally depends on the project. In this case, for example, you have a private blockchain first. Second, it's regional operations. So I won't go into the details, but it uses channels, so not everybody's seeing the data. But also, basically, what it does is what you were referring to is the easy way of you pseudonymize by saying, okay, I don't link the data to one person. Each time there is data, I link it to some other value, I would say, and the link between the person and the data is recorded off chain, and it could be erased. Then the GDPR and the deletion is handled off chain.
And all the issue is to know if the data protection authority will recognize that the unreadable data, because we break the link or any other solution like that, will be recognized as the compliant solution or not. And we are trying to ask again and again and again to the data protection authority in France. And I think that we have the same answer.
Difficulties?
We don't know for the moment. And that was the same. And they still don't know for the moment. So we try to find solution.
As François said, it really depends on the kind of project, because
Right.
for some projects you don't even need to have access to the document or to the information, so you can have an inaccessibility by design, I would say, with some zero knowledge proof protocols,
Right.
and you say, okay, we have your diploma, but I don't even need to show it to you, just guaranteeing that you do have the diploma, but I won't show it to you. So there are actually many protocols of ZKP, the zero knowledge proof, that are allowing to do so.
Right. Interesting. And so I wanted to get into a few more of the problems then. And another one that I've kind of read a little bit about is the idea of automated decision making. And the GDPR obviously has some requirements for that as well. The basic one is that you need to have a human who can intervene, but this is only for automated decision making, which impacts people significantly. So it's not everything that's automated falls under the GDPR. It's automated decision making based on people's data that can have a big impact on them. And this is a question that I don't have a clear answer to, that I personally have no idea about, but maybe some of you guys have worked with smart contracts, and maybe you could tell me then whether smart contracts might fall under this part of the law then, if they can affect people significantly enough that it may be under the GDPR and then would either require human input or maybe be forbidden then by the default setting.
It's the same thing.
Okay, pretty much I would say that the program itself, which is the smart contract, could be indeed handling data which is important and has an impact on someone. So, in my opinion, there's no way of handling correctly the GDPR with this without linking this to the notion of consent.
Okay.
So I would say the smart contract would need to include the notion of consent.
Right.
Mhm.
That's what we are doing. I'm currently working on a Edge 2020 program about healthcare and clinical trials, and we are currently working on it. We try to put the consent on the blockchain and not the data. So that's a mix between the two solutions, and the blockchain is here to handle the consent problem, the consent issue, and that's the main heart of all the issue after with the automatic decisions. Yeah, that's what we try to handle like that.
The human intervention issue within a smart contract protocol, I mean automation, is not new. You have the same kind of issue with any program code that is currently running. Now, if you say, okay, you have a low account credit, so you don't have access to your credit card anymore.
Yeah.
That's not a human action.
Sure.
It's a program that has decided that you all know the code is low. We are talking a lot about code is low on the blockchain, on the smart contracts, but it has already been the case with many automated programs since decades and decades already. So it's not new. So if GDPR is a human intervention possibility, because it's automated, so they cannot just focus on the smart contract. They have to address any automated program, and there are a lot of them.
Yeah.
So
There's the same issue with the big data and
Yeah.
deep learning, for
Right.
example. So, in fact, once you have a data processing which is involving an automatic decision process, you are first to make a lot of emphasis on the information of the people. You have to be very clear to the people and to get a consent, but a very nice
Clear
consent.
consent.
And the people they have really to understand what they are going to put their
Give.
hand on that. Okay? And also we have to answer the right of access. I mean, every people they should ask to the data controller, but again, data controller. They have the right to ask. Okay, why did you take this decision regarding me, for example? Explain me why. So with the blockchain, you may explain why, because it's not a secret. On deep learning, it's quite impossible. You don't know why the deep learning told this guy is a fraud or is a thief or has to be hanged or something like that. So it's quite more difficult in deep learning.
it's more difficult. It's not impossible. But,
Yeah.
you can trace back.
Yeah, but it's hard.
It's hard.
Good luck.
Alright, well, let's address that then maybe a little bit too, because over here we've already heard a little bit about how you're using a blockchain to store consent, and now we've just heard that as well. So maybe can I just ask then, there's lots of negatives that people like to talk about here, maybe we'd call it FUD, but so I want to ask if there's any positives, if there's any opportunities for blockchain that result out of the GDPR here.
I think that the blockchain is not the biggest enemy of the GDPR, and vice versa. It's exactly the same in the other sense. I think that the blockchain could be a tool for the GDPR compliance. It must not be seen as the monster of the GDPR and the nightmare with this. And we can handle the issue and find solutions, but we also need the cooperation of the data protection authorities in the European Union, and we need answers just to move forward little by little and step by step. I'm saying, okay, we can do it. They said it's okay, and step by step we'll arrive it will be successful for all the projects. But I think it's a chance. It's not a negative point for me.
Yeah, it provides very useful tools, integrity certification, auditability. Obviously there are issues, the pseudonymization, the right to access, modify your data. Okay, but it also provides a lot of very insightful tools.
And also tools specifically for GDPR. GDPR needs consent and also traceability of deletion request.
This is the best
Traceability, there's nothing better for traceability than using a blockchain. So for this, it's the right solution.
Sounds good. Okay, there's one more question I have, one more problem I want to raise, even though we did just hear that it's not all problems, but just to address this last problem then, I wanted to talk about international data transfers under the GDPR. So maybe Bruno, you could just explain to me real quick what the rules are regarding data transfers outside of the EU.
Yeah, in fact, once you're processing personal data in the Euro, you can do what you want. In fact, if I process the data in France, in Portugal, in Germany, it's exactly the same. Okay, it's not enough that the personal data are physically in Europe, because you may imagine, for example, it's very often situation though I provide my information to a SaaS or a cloud provider actor, and he promised me that the data are going to stay in Europe. But if the data are accessed from US, for example, it's a data transfer, cross-border data transfer. So the location of the data itself is not enough. Okay, and so the question is, the other countries, do these other countries offer the same level of So you have several countries like Israel, Switzerland, Argentina, for example. It's exactly the same than France. And I may process my personal data in Argentina. It's exactly the same that in Lyon, Marseille, Strasbourg, and so on. But US, for example, it's not the same. And we had in the past international agreement called the Safe Harbor. It was a failure. We trust the American, and we didn't have to trust the American. And then they have they deal with a shield,
Privacy shield.
Privacy shield,
Yeah.
which is in big danger right now because they are going to renegotiate it with the GDPR, and it's not going to be an easy task. Okay, so you're right. There is a lot of questions, and once there is one node. Which is outside Europe, there is a cross-border flow. So normally you have to do something, so you may get a code of conduct. So the GDPR gives this opportunity, but there's no still existing code of conduct. So maybe the blockchain community should work on this to create a code of conduct for this. Or you have also to get the consent, which is a different consent. It is a consent for the cross-border flow.
Right.
I have to accept it also, not only to be part of the blockchain. So you're right. It's a hot topic also. Yeah. So or it's forbidden for a node to be out in Europe. It's blockchain for everywhere in the planet, but not for Europe, which is crazy. So.
That would be the worst case,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, did anybody else have anything to add?
And to complete the reflection, that's the cloud out from Microsoft. Now we are hearing about it. It's more complicated now because they are in contradiction with from the US, and the GAFA has Microsoft will say, no, we have the US law now, what can we do? I'm sorry, I'm repeating again, but that's the only one thing that will unblock the situation and will give us the path to do the things correctly and being compliant completely.
This problem, this issue level, this is not clear level.
Yeah.
This is state, Europe and US, so
Right.
The players are not the same.
Yeah, but we've seen that the France with the Informatic and Liberty law from in 78 was one of the first in Europe to give the pass, so maybe we can say
in the European Commission, in fact, because the only chance to modify the GDPR. To the European Parliament and to the Council, they have to provide a report at least for the 25th of May 2020, and the report about an evaluation of the GDPR. Where we're right or wrong, did we miss something? Maybe blockchain, maybe. So the question is not in the Data Protection Authority. The Data Protection Authority, they don't make the law. They check that you apply correctly the law. But the law is in Brussels, in the European Commission, the parliaments, and so on. So the lobbying is to be done there. And from now, because in 2 years from now, the report is maybe they just start to write it.
Francois, can you add anything then maybe about these private permission blockchains? Because I think maybe you have better opportunities there to kind of regulate how data flows internationally and maybe to set up certain guarantees too. Would you agree, or can you elaborate?
Well, what I can say with private blockchains is that, typically we're talking private permission blockchains, such as Hyperledger Fabric. The point is that, at least because I'm not a legal person, so all these things are not super easy for me to handle. But basically, the idea with private blockchains is that permission ones is that you have a good sense of governance, and you can do pretty much. It's like playing with doing a project with Ethereum where the network is there and you have to handle with what it does and possible flaws or whatever, etc. And there's an open community and you don't handle everything that's happening. The idea with a private permission blockchain is pretty much that for every project you start everything from scratch, and before doing anything you think the architecture through. And one thing important to understand is that apart from using an architecture that is already in place, a blockchain project is not a blockchain project. It's a systems integration project with a little bit of blockchain, and the idea is to set up the requirements. You have requirements for your project, and the idea is to set up the right architecture for that. And in the requirements, you have a right to be forgotten, handling, etc., cross-border, or whatever. Well, is the responsibility, I would say, of the integrator to handle that before anything is.
That's a kind of data privacy impact assessment, in fact, that you do in the requirements.
Yeah.
In fact, that's joining the two topics at the same time: the data protection and the architecture, and they merge.
And basically, possibly for this or that project, the blockchain part will be very tiny, and the GDPR requirements will be handled with a number of other technologies. Just saying, so the difference between indeed playing with a public blockchain, but BC Diploma is a good example where you can do things actually pretty well towards GDPR requirements. But of course, it's much easier
on a private where you can kind of set this up beforehand.
You do whatever you want. You can even consider. I mentioned evaluating the risks that you have for a project. Here, you start from scratch, so you will really evaluate your project. If you consider that I do not even need I do not even need to encrypt my data because I have separated the data from the owner, and it's sufficient because also I'm using channels in that Hyperledger Fabric, etc. And there are too few people involved in each channel, etc. And it's fine. And from security, fine. You did something rather simple. There's no need to encrypt and re-encrypt and have more difficult on the public blockchain.
And then to maybe address some of those issues, Vincent, I was hoping you could tell me a little bit more then about, you mentioned zero-knowledge proofs. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about all this whole idea of cryptography as applied to the blockchain.
Yeah.
And also, earlier you had mentioned Monero briefly. And maybe we could,
Monero.
yeah, and maybe we could just briefly discuss that. And I know there's a whole host of blockchains that kind of try to focus more on privacy to anonymize transactions.
Basically, what we have to keep in mind is that when the first blockchain, I mean Bitcoin, was created, it was purely based on cryptography. I mean, it's a protocol based on cryptography because it was meant to be trying to be anonymous, trying to be decentralized, so they needed algorithm to replace the trust that was provided initially by the banks. Okay, so that's Satoshi was thought that there would be some anonymity. There isn't. So there were new protocols that have been added to provide that missing anonymity. The first one I mentioned was the ZKP, Zero Knowledge Proof. It's algorithms. There are many of them that can ensure that you actually own a data, that you actually own some kind of information without having to show it. There's, for example, you want me to give you an example of how it works, or
Might be
Sure.
getting
It's
too
pretty-
far into it, but
If you want
there's
to
a
buy
simple
alcohol,
example.
you
Yeah,
need to
there's
be
some,
18.
yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
If you want to drink alcohol, you need to be 18 or major.
Yeah.
And you just have to check, and they said, okay, you are, but they are not saying, giving you the birth date or
right.
Exactly.
But
anything.
also,
Right.
well,
Exactly.
more impossible, more important, when people don't want to display how much they have on their bank account, and they want to rent something, but they need to have at least as much money on on their bank account, and the zero knowledge proof can be used to just say, okay, they respect the requirement
Right, without showing exactly what they have.
without saying how
Or
much they have.
As if I want to rent my apartment, I want to ask you 3 months of salary, but I want to make sure that you have at least 3 times the amount of the rent, but you don't want me to see your actual salary, so you can build a kind of ZKP to prove that, okay, I do have enough money, but I'm not going to show you how much I have.
Yeah. And now, do zero knowledge proofs also then obscure kind of the sender and receiver and thereby make it anonymous? Or, because I believe Zcash does do that, but I'm
Yeah.
not sure if that's part of the zero knowledge proof or...
The ZKP, Zero Knowledge Proof, is a generic name for many protocols.
Okay.
It's just a way of saying, okay, I'm going to prove you something without showing it to you. After that, you can put in place some transaction-based ZKP, some proof-based ZKP. It depends on your need, basically. And you can put it by design at the beginning of your blockchain and say, by default, you have ZKP on all your transactions, or on the way you share your keys, your public keys, anything. You can put that on any transaction you want. And to get back to your first question, Monero, for example, I'm not sure that Monero actually uses ZKP. Sorry?
Ring signature.
Yeah, okay, certainly. And what they provide is the Tor protocol, which is not new, and
Right.
a lot of stuff are not new within the blockchain.
Right.
And so they just saying, okay, you're not sharing, as you don't share your key when you browse with the Tor protocol, which
Yeah.
is the Onion protocol that makes you go by many servers, which should be, at least the majority of them should be anonymous, so you cannot trace me back. So it's the same thing. I'm not sharing my public key or any private key either. I'm moving that through layers, anonymous layers. So in the end, the address I'm showing to you and the wallet address that I'm owning. So this is done through a series of layers that are anonymous through the Tor protocol.
Got it. And Bruno, then, so to bring this back to the GDPR, assuming I've maybe encrypted my my transactions or whatever on the blockchain or anonymized it, what implications does that have then?
I mean, on which point? Excellent.
If you encrypt or anonymize data that you've stored on a blockchain, and now I'm coming back with the GDPR, what does that mean then?
I mean, the encryption is just, I mean, a security tools, in fact. So, as it was mentioned, I mean, each time we have to evaluate the risk. If there is low risk, we don't need to put a lot of efforts. But if there is risk for the people, we have to do something. Encryption is one of the way. So that's one point. The anonymization is completely different question. I mean, anonymization is a way of going out of the GDPR, but you not be wrong. I mean, you have to be sure of you. If you say these data are anonymous, you have to be very sure of it, because the data protection authority they have another view, and they are the authority. We are not the authority, so they are right every time. So we don't have to mistake between pseudonymous data and anonymous data. So pseudonymous data are still personal data. We are on the scope of GDPR, and if by chance by work we are really getting anonymous data outside of the scope of the GDPR, the anonymous data is
Quite complicated.
Quite difficult.
It's a challenge.
Okay.
But they proposed in the European Union some kind of anonymization, which was a kind of stronger pseudonymization, looking like anonymization, but in fact that's not. But they proposed this, but it was not, for the moment, it's not
accepted yet.
We'll see. Wait and see.
Got it.
We'll see.
So it sounds like there's a lot where we still have to.
There are so much lobbies about it, because the standard right now, the anonymization, to prove at the same time, because when they are doing some audits or your complete process about anonymization, they are very precise little points, and that's why it's so difficult right now to be recognized as an anonymizer. But there are few, but there are.
Okay. I wanted to ask all of you then, maybe we have some people in the audience today who have their own startup, like that, using blockchain technology professionally, and you have this GDPR, coming at you like that, and maybe you don't know what we can get some expert advice here, within the next days and even beyond that. 10 days is a lot of time, but
No.
let's start there then with 10 days. What can we expect in 10 days?
They are looking for the same law as data protection law in France, so don't go to Switzerland.
Because
10 days,
I would
not
say there are two types of projects. There's those that are already running meaning being developed or running, and those that are still in the thinking phase. For those running, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to answer because
Run away.
at least for the others, really, it's like in every project, the most important part is the architecture part. It's like building a house. The most important part is the foundation. Okay, then you can build something on top, and then build on top of the top, etc. But then most important is the architecture. And you don't want to build a project and then later think of GDPR, because then you have to crash everything and then restart or run. So think of it in the architecture by design. Exactly. Anyway, it's a requirement.
Yeah.
It's a requirement. Every project that starts now has to be secure by design.
And that's what I was saying before with the data privacy impact assessment. Project, and to say, okay, in that
And
sense.
also an argument related to that, which is important for entrepreneurs, know that if you have to stop your project and
all legacy systems would need to be changed from scratch, and these are new projects, so you can build your project with privacy by design. I wouldn't say the same with legacy projects that are 20, 30 years old and where they should apply GDPR laws as well. They are going to suffer.
And to pay.
And to pay. But I would say the least you can do is at least provide that you are acting in the right direction. I've read some documents saying that even if you're not 100% compliant, if you can show that you have been on the path to,
It's a good start.
They won't kill you at the beginning.
The first thing is to appoint a DPO, because for the confidence, I mean, I'm imagining for a startup in blockchain, when they're going to look for some from business angel, the business angels, they start to raise questions about the liability of your business model. So on this point, then I think you have, as it was told there, you have to think your project GDPR proof, in fact, GDPR ready. And you did mention some points, but another point is the data portability. I mean, if you don't plan from scratch the data portability, once a customer is going to ask, I quit you and I go to your competition, to another blockchain platform, and I ask you to transfer my data from your ledger to the other one, if you didn't plan for it, if you didn't plan it, it's going to be a nightmare, for example. So you have really to think about it, to be prepared to a snap inspection, in fact, or so. So that's to plan.
Perfect. Okay, I think that wraps it up with my questions, and I think that's a good segue then to take questions from the audience, and we are, of course, afterwards, or most of us are going to be available to chat too, but please. Yeah.
So, first of all, I'm not sure that the exchange is a central point of anything or even point of interest, because if you think of any transaction on a blockchain, the exchange is just not there. For instance, in Ethereum, in Bitcoin blockchain, you can add some information, some additional information in addition to the transaction. If I take your name, your phone number, I can add that at the end of my transaction and put that in the Bitcoin blockchain forever. And who's going to put that in the blockchain is the miner. The miner is going to receive the data, and one of the miners is going to win the reward, and he's the one who's going to do that. So if someone is going to be liable for putting your phone number, well, I'm going to do it, but if you don't do it, putting your phone number on blockchain, it's that miner that day, at that minute. And then everyone will replicate that. So if you say, hey, it was my phone number, because this is the only known entity. The exchange is out of the loop.
The miner replicating the HTTP packets and pushing them and building the network. The accountable person is the one that has built the packet and created the request, for example. And the same thing on the blockchain. The accountable person would be the one who has built the transaction initially, the one who has put the sensitive information. But the miner...
So if I put his name and phone number on a public forum, who is responsible for that? Who is going to remove that?
You.
He's going to contact the forum, the public discussion. The forum is going to remove it.
Yeah, but they will... Yeah, okay. The first accountable person for deleting information would be the forum, the website. But after that, trust me, they will chase you and try
They
to.
will ban me, but
It depends. If you're on hardware.fr, yeah, they will ban you. But if you're on something much more sensitive with political views, they will chase you and they will find you. You know, like
They
Liam
will
Neeson.
kill you.
No.
again,
Yeah.
Okay,
So it depends.
Bonne chance.
It depends. Bonne chance. It depends on the weight of the sensitivity of the data. But they would do it, and you would be accountable for that because you have put that in the transaction.
If there is one point where you can control the data before putting it forever on the public blockchain, it is the miner. This is all I'm saying. Second point.
It's like
Okay.
With public blockchains.
Yes, public.
Yeah, of course.
Private
blockchain
blockchain
is like internet. If you put information on the internet, yeah, anyone can put information on the internet. There is no regulation about it. You can put my name and
Yeah. Exactly.
ask to remove it.
Yeah.
there's nothing I
Yeah,
can do.
but my point is,
There is a
if
gray area.
there is one chance of blocking that data, it is at miner.
But
No, but there's a gray area in the
But
regulation.
it's not going to happen.
Yeah, but there are KYC, etc. You know. And again, it's not blockchain. It's blockchain and everything around. KYC is not blockchain.
How you build your services, what is your obligation, what is your liability, that's what comes in, and that's how it falls under.
There's KYC regulation.
Maurice, I'm happy to see that even for blockchain experts it's not so easy subject. So.
I'm not a legal guy, you know.
Second point.
Bruno said that some data needs to remain stored for a long time, so blockchain is maybe sometimes a good idea. But what about the following scenario? I have one Bitcoin and I want to invest in one ICO, but the ICO is taking only Ether. So I'm going to transfer that Bitcoin into Ether and transfer that Ether into the ICO to get the ICO token that is XYZ. And so for me, the processing goal of using Ether was for 5 minutes between Bitcoin and the token on the ICO. So for me, after 5 minutes, I want the transaction gone.
For you, I mean, as a customer, I mean, as a user.
It's like I've got euro, I'm going in Switzerland, I want to buy something Swiss francs, and so I'm going to an exchange, I'm going to take 10 euro, I'm going to get 5 or 6 Swiss francs, I'm going to buy a drink in Switzerland. The exchange that saw me for a minute just took the money, gave me.
Yeah, but the blockchain needs to keep the proof of this transaction. So yes, I agree. As a customer, you have your money and so on. It's finished for you. The story is finished. But for the blockchain,
So
I understand that one of the goals of the ledger is to keep the proof if there is something wrong.
And my understanding is that GDPR is explicit on this point. It is not because it has been built that way that it is yes, it was built that way, but for me, from my point of view, I just wanted Ether for 5 minutes. And
Yeah, but what if you don't have the right to do it? The same way that you don't have the right to spend dollars, American dollars, in some countries because of American regulations. So what if you don't have the right? So we want to have the possibility to track you. Sorry, once again. We want to prove to see that you have actually used Ether if you didn't have the right to, or use US dollar if you didn't have the right to.
But the time you have to keep the data, it's not for the data subject, it's for the controller, in fact. That's the
they
best.
say
So-
3 years,
or more.
5 years,
10.
10 years. Okay,
Yeah.
but not more than 10.
so
If you have a good reason.
what I think is interesting though, because I think it's a legitimate question. I think the last one also a great question, but I think the issue for both of them is just that you're not going to be able to enforce it on a public permissionless blockchain, and that's the end game there. You know, you don't know who the miner is, or you might know who the miner is by their pseudonym, but you don't know who that's related to necessarily. You don't know where they are in the world. You don't know how you're going to access them. You can't do that for the 10,000 nodes that there are on the Bitcoin network. And it's the same thing for Ethereum, obviously. You know, if you transfer this, you trade in Bitcoin for Ether, and then you go to your ICO only at the point where you come in contact with this company that's going to give you your coin for your Ether. they're the only ones that are immediately identifiable there, and I think that's really the point where it hinges on, you know. Before that, it's I mean, you know, blockchains were designed to be censorship resistant, and I think this is one of those a perfect proof of that, where maybe they're not intending to censor Bitcoin or something, but I think just the way it's been architected, it's going to be difficult to enforce something like that, even if you're correct, you know, even if what you're saying is completely true. And so what I think you were saying earlier about whether it's an exchange or it's another company that interacts with blockchain, that's the point where it becomes visible. And that's why I liked your answer so much, because those are the ones that you can actually hold accountable. And so it makes sense to me then what you're saying, that they would be seen as a controller then.
That's the link between the first part and the second part,
Yeah.
the off-chain and the in-chain. And
Yeah.
in fact, that's here that the barrier is growing up, in fact. And that here is all the link that you can keep with the fiat world and the blockchain world, I think. I don't know if
You
you share
don't-
the
yeah.
vision, but
Basically, you don't want to put that much responsibility on the miners, or you will lose all
Because-
the incentive.
yeah, and if you get this reflection at the same time, you can consider that they are working, they are workers, and you need to get them a contract. And you can go in many cases like that, and it's very complicated to handle all of them at the same time. So that's why the miner was quickly put off the main thinking about it.
Mhm.
That's my point of view. I'm not the only one.
I think that makes sense. Do you have any other questions then?
It was about the same. So if you're running a marketplace, it doesn't matter with blockchain or without a blockchain. Very responsible. Blockchain is just the element. It's how you build your services and reliability is what matters. In the public world, it's a whole different game. So
Right.
that's why you cannot blame anyone if someone puts a name up there.
Other comments or questions?
Well,
Yeah,
Sure.
please.
but it is purely GDPR. So you're in the public sector, and there are six lawful way of processing data, and the last one is legitimate interests. And do you know why that specific one has been excluded for public?
Maybe it's not related at all with blockchain, so
I-
let's just have a look. So I was surprised at the beginning, so I raised a question to Brussels. No one was able to answer me who had this CD ID. No, the ID is normally for public sector, for public actor, or public authority. Normally, most of our data processing are based on legal. There's a law, okay? And then we have so 99% of our processing are based either on law or on public mission. And then the legitimate interest, we still have the right. I got the question two weeks ago. So if you read carefully, in fact, we still have the right, but only for our internal process. I mean, for our HR processing, for example, we may choose this legitimate. It's not written in the GDPR. That you have to listen carefully, and maybe we will have some written document about it. But that's the explanation. We are losing the legitimate interest, but it's not a very. It's a weak basis. So we